Okay, thank you. Some, still see critical media scholarship as marginalized, and that can be argued. But others say that the margin is becoming wider. To exemplify this, I want to introduce a young scholar at the forefront of the renewed approach to critical media studies. Thomas Allmer is a lecturer of social justice at Murray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh and a member of the United Theory of Information Research Group in Austria. His publications include Towards a Critical Theory of Surveillance in Information Capitalism and Critical Theory in Social Media between Emancipation and Commodification. Mr. Allmer will talk about social media and capitalism, communication between domination and emancipation. Dear colleagues, let us welcome Thomas Allmer.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I have to say I'm really, really pleased to be here today. And what I want to also say is actually, in terms of the topics, the research topics, so I'm going to shift my topics a bit at the moment. So I'm currently running a project at the University of Banja about academic labor and working conditions and how new technologies do have an impact on working conditions. But I would like to focus in this talk still on social media because I just thought your title and main theme of the conference. And I just published a book last year about social media, which is about privacy, surveillance, based on the critical theory and political economy approach. I was actually talking to Nick yesterday when we drove from Zagreb to Banja Luka, and I think it fits quite nicely actually what Nick was going to say just in his talk in the morning. And I think my contribution here is a further addition. So we'll talk a little bit about an empirical result of a survey I conducted in Austria a couple of years ago, but I'm going to start with the more theoretical introduction of social media and what it means to study social media in the social sciences at the moment. And I would like to start by giving you this slide here, because I think that's a quite important movement that came up in the last years. And if we look at the social and economic inequalities in our society, and I think the Occupy movement is just an example here. I think you can place here many, many other movements that came up in the last years. But I think those kind of movements are a response to the social and economic inequalities in our society. And for example, the critique of the Occupy movement was to a certain extent that big corporations and the financial system control the world, or just a minority benefits and thereby undermine democracy, as you know. And those movements, like the Occupy movement, used social media, including Facebook, for their internal communication, but also for the external coordination in order to reach a global audience. And at the same time, that's the contradiction in here I would like to focus on. At the same time, Facebook and others like Twitter are part of the financial system and are big corporations. You can see here the revenue of Facebook from 2008 onwards to today, 2015. And the founder and CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, is today one of the richest people in the world with a net worth of more than 50 billion US dollars. And I think that just indicates that there are contradictions going on in our society, and Nick was talking about that as well. There are contradictions, and that also is linked to your title of the conference, contradictions in the way that social media can be considered as power structures on the one hand, but at the same time as sites of power structure. We commodify the online world to a certain extent, but at the same time, and I think that's quite important for a critical perspective, it entails some element in order to strengthen the commons, the network and information commons. And my argument is that based on a critical theory, and what we mean with critical theory is currently under debate, but with a critical theory, I think we are able to analyze those contradictions on a theoretical and empirical level. So one of my main research questions, if you want it in this way, is to study the objective and subjective aspects of new media. What are the limitations? What are the constraints of them? And at the same time, are there any emancipatory potentials in order to work towards a so-called commons-based information society? And as I said at the very beginning, my approach is based on a critical theory approach. And I just would like to talk a little bit about the main ideas, or how I understand critical theory. And I think if we go back to the German sociological positivist dispute of the 1960s, which was pretty much a dispute about the methods of social science, Jürgen Habermas drew up the quite important idea, and it was somehow an epistemological insight that knowledge production, academic knowledge production, is always embedded in a certain social context. So he argues there are no objective observations, there are no value-free, neutral, apolitical statements possible. So it's kind of an epistemological question. What kind of knowledge do we produce in society and in academia? Theodor Adorno, for example, made a quite clear statement and brings in the more political insight in saying that traditional social research tends to study the appearance and therefore just supports the status quo, what exists and becomes sooner or later. That refers a bit what Nick also mentioned about the myth, but the Frankfurt School still tends to speak about the ideology, but I think the ideas are not that different. And my insights, my research is based on these ideas. I'm interested in an emancipatory research project which has a normative and partial approach, giving voice to the voiceless, if you want to have it in that way. Such an approach is pretty much based on a humanist insight that humans are in the center, the core in our society. So that's the main idea, in contrast to post-human or post-modern approaches. I think that's quite important. It's still a humanist approach. I think one can summarize to a certain extent the critical theory as I understand it, based on the Frankfurt School understanding, that critical theory tries to study the dialectics, the contradictions between essence and appearance. It tries to analyze society in its social totality, and that's quite important It is interested in human emancipation. And last but not least, a critical theory understands the social reality as an outcome of historical human practices. It's always an outcome what has been done, has been going on for the last decades or centuries. And because it is an outcome of human results, it is also changeable. And I think that's still quite important within critical theory, in the sense that we, and that also refers to your comment before, I think we don't need a nihilistic approach to this answer. I think it's still important and possible to intervene into society and what is going on, and also in the social media context. I would like to talk a little bit about the philosophical understanding, because Wolfgang Hofkirchen, who is an Austrian philosopher, he tries to argue, if we look at philosophy, we primarily have three different main questions. And one is on the epistemological level, trying to make the point to analyze philosophical theory of the method, which includes knowledge, understanding, and so on and so forth. On an ontological level, we do have the question of the philosophical theory of reality, of being. And last but not least, on the praxeological level, we do have the question about the theory of praxis, which includes norms, values, ethics, aesthetics, and so on and so forth. So it's the idea of philosophy, pretty much according to Hofkirchen, is that we do have three different questions. The first one is, which theory, which methods do we use in order to answer the question in which society we live, in order to answer the question, well, when we know in which society we live, we also need some political and practical questions in order to change society to the better. So it just indicates that those different levels are somehow mutually shaping and interconnected. And my talk or my research is pretty much based on these insights, because I'm trying to talk a little bit about theoretical foundations of social media, of new technologies and society. And that's also linked to the question of privacy and surveillance, as Nick mentioned, and the relation, as Karl Marx mentioned it, the relation between the productive forces and the relation of production. And secondly, I'm going to introduce an empirical case study which I conducted a couple of years ago in Austria, and I will talk about the contradictions and the trade-offs students and users of social media are accepting in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of social media. So it might be the ontological level, how we can consider society and social media. And last but not least, I think that's quite important here, that I'm going to talk about political praxis as well. So what are the potentials of social media, and what are the limitations in order to work towards a so-called commons-based information society. And my parts I'm going to talk about, in that sense, also mutually shaping each other and connect to each other. My talk and my research I'm presenting here is pretty much based on two publications, as you just introduced at the very beginning. And one book came out in 2012, which I pretty much wrote about surveillance in a more philosophical tradition based on Michel Foucault. But it's also about a book that just came out last year as critical theory and So let's start with some theoretical foundations. And my argument is, if we want to talk about social media, and social media can be considered as a technosocial system, that we also need to answer the question how society and technology are actually connected. And I think once we know that, we also can answer questions about social media. But I also think that we need to answer more general questions before we go to social media. I think that's quite important here. And this model actually is from Andrew Feenberg. Andrew Feenberg is a quite established scholar based in Canada, and he talks about the relationship between society and technology. And he argues that if we have those two phenomena, they are kind of interconnected. It's a dynamic circle. So you do have, on the one hand, the social design of technology, and on the other, the technological assessment in our society. And Andrew Feenberg's model, I would say, is a very, very general one. It's an, how to say, anthropological things that I think you can apply it to different societies and different epochs. But Karl Marx was talking about the productive forces and the relations of production. I think that's a very similar model, because the relations of production are those relations that are structuring our society, and technology can pretty much be considered as the productive forces. And I think there's a very similar relationship in capitalism. So I think this is a more generic, more general model, which can also apply to modern capitalist society. So that means for me that, using Feenberg's idea, if we look at the connection between technology and society, so you do have on the one strand the design aspect, on the other hand the assessment aspect. And what I want to say with this is that technology is never neutral. You always have a certain impact. It always depends on which society we design, conceptualize, and produce technology. That's the design part in this slide. And at the same time, those technologies, at least some elements of those technologies, can be used differently in different societies. So you could use social media or other technologies in a completely different way in a socialist society or in a feudal society, and so on and so forth. I think we also have to ask the question, in which society do we apply those technologies? And I think this very general model can also be applied to social media or social networking science. And if we go to social media and the internet, I think one can argue that in the last decades of capitalist production, the last decades of modern society, we could see a massive increase of information commodities in a quantitative and qualitative level, like knowledge, ideas, communication, cultural content, emotions, etc., etc. I think that's one of the arguments the Italian Marxist tradition is trying to make, like Harvey, Michael Hardy and Tony Negri and others, that we are going through a new sphere within capitalist society where information and communication got quite important for capital accumulation. In that sense, I think social media can be considered as a new strategy of capital accumulation under post-40s conditions after the so-called dot-com crisis in 2000. And it's quite interesting, actually. If you look at the history of social media, those platforms tended to pop up in 2004, 5, 6, 7. It was one of these companies who survived the dot-com crisis in 2000 and found new ideas, new ways in order to make money and to accumulate capital. So I think it can be considered as a new strategy, and that's what I was saying in the discussion with Nick as well. So I think it's a new strategy, but at the same time, I think it's a very risky one. I'm not saying that, well, there are companies who are making big money, but at the same time, I think the whole idea about making money is based on a certain myth or ideology, because everyone believes you can make a lot of money with advertising, but it's not, in some cases it's true, but not always. And I'm not saying that it will break down, but I think there's a certain risk within this economic strategy that it can crack sooner or later. So that's nothing more in this argument. And, well, the popularity of those platforms just indicates that we're going through a new epoch in that way. So if you look at the most accessed websites worldwide, those private companies like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and so on and so forth, so you know them probably better than I do, but those are among the most accessed websites. And it's also quite interesting if you look at the most accessed websites worldwide, there's just one platform, one website, which is not privately owned, and that's Wikipedia. That's the only website, and I'm really keen to support such a project because it brings up new questions, how we are managing information and who is owning those kind of information. But then we'll come back to this later. But as long as we stick to the traditional private-owned social media, I think we have to ask two questions. That's what Nick was going to say in the morning as well. We have to look at the privacy and the surveillance aspect of those social media platforms, because that's the whole idea behind those platforms, at least from an economic point of view. I'm not saying that that's the only reason. I think there come in some political and cultural elements as well, but from an economic standpoint, the privacy and surveillance elements are quite important on these platforms. And if we talk about surveillance and privacy, I was just asking myself, well, how can we theorize those phenomena based on the political economy and critical theory approach? And Graham Murdoch and Peter Golding, who are two political economists from the UK, they argue that we need consideration of the commodity and ideology critique. So for them it's important to consider both things. And just as a simple explanation, Nick was talking about the myth. I think the critical theory understanding of ideology is very similar. It's to a certain extent about the differences, as I've mentioned before, between essence and appearance, and in the way that there might be a contradiction between reality and how people think about reality. And once we do have a difference between those two things, one can argue that ideology or myth are occurring. And on the other hand, I think commodity, that's the very long tradition of Marxist analysis, so I don't want to go in detail here, but the idea of the commodity is pretty much that you do have this distinction between use value and exchange value, meaning that every product which is produced in societies does have a certain use value, be it my computer or a table. So every product does have a use value to a certain extent, but it's up to modern society that we also make an exchange value out of these products. And then there comes in the whole idea and theory about surplus value and so on and so forth. So I'm not going into detail here, but I'm just saying that I think these are the main ideas behind the terms of ideology and commodity. And I think in that sense, the political economy approach is very close what Nick was going to say in the morning, that it's not enough to just look at ideology, how people think. It's also about how people behave, what they do in real life. And I think what they buy, what they consume, what are the social relations. I think we have also to look at the material realities. And I think that's another explanation what Nick was saying, that we have to combine those two different phenomena in society. The political economy talks about commodity and ideological critique. And back to the surveillance and privacy issues, my argument in the book is somehow that we can consider the whole debate about privacy as an ideology of modern society, of liberal society. So I think the privacy debate is to a certain extent ideological, and I'm going to continue this argument in a minute. And the surveillance sphere can be considered, at least from an economic point of view, as a commodity critique, because it's the new aspect of capital accumulation in different economic spheres like production, distribution, circulation, and so on and so forth. So just to reflect a little bit, I'm talking about social media, privacy, and surveillance, because I think because those social media platforms are dominantly privately owned, I think it's important to talk about privacy and surveillance. How can we theorize privacy and surveillance? There are different ways, but I think from a political economy perspective, it's important to theorize them as ideology and commodity. And if we talk about privacy, and if you look at the literature of privacy and online privacy, it's quite interesting because there has been going on a lot of critique on the concept of privacy in itself. So there's a lot of philosophical discussion going on, and has been going on in the 60s and the 70s, that privacy, or talking about privacy, is very, very linked to the idea of modern society, because it's very often used as to having individual privacy, and it also means to have the freedom from public intervention. And it includes certain rights, and those rights are mostly interpreted and understood as property interests and of rights of private property. And I think that's one of the main arguments here, that the privacy term is used in modern liberal societies as an ideology and a way in order to argue for a liberal democracy where everyone is the owner of him or herself and also those things he produces. So I think that fits very well into capitalist modern society. I'm not saying that we don't need a privacy concept, but I'm just saying that the current discussion about privacy fits very well into capitalist discourse of private property. So that's one of the arguments here. And I think one of the contradictions is actually, if you try to combine privacy and surveillance discussions, actually, that liberal democracy and market economy actually requires political and economic surveillance. We have seen that many, many times in the past. And I think that's the contradiction in the way that privacy and surveillance contradict each other in modern society. So capitalism is trying to promise value, namely privacy, which isn't able to fulfill this value. I think that's the contradiction here between privacy and surveillance. As I said at the slide before, I'm not saying that we should abolish privacy at all, but I think that's my contribution to the privacy discourse. I think we need a new understanding, a new term of privacy. And I would like to study privacy in the context of domination, of power, of social struggles, of resource control, and all these issues. And I also would like to see that we are going to start to ask who is actually able to obtain privacy in our society. Because I think there's a certain class structure within this idea that we do have those groups in our society who are still able to make their money private. And for example, the Panama Papers a couple of months ago showed that quite clearly that there are many secrets, or the bank secret in Germany and other discourses. So there is a lot of privacy in our society, and at the same time, privacy is constantly threatened by the ordinary people. So I think there's a certain class structure within the discussion about privacy. And I would like to open a bit the discourse and bring in the idea of modern society actually in order to overcome privacy threats and to question the economic privacy protection. I think we need some transparency here and more protection on the other hand, for example, protection of workers in terms of worker rights and so on and so forth. I think that's kind of the contradiction here, and it's just very simplified and a main idea of how I would understand privacy, and it's just an attempt to start discussion from the beginning and to say, well, I think we have made some mistake in the past in terms of how we define privacy, and I think we have to reconsider those ideas. And secondly, and that's the aspect of surveillance, and that's now a little bit about my book that came out in 2012 with Peter Lang, where I'm trying to make a more philosophical standpoint, philosophical perspective about surveillance. And my argument is, if we talk about surveillance, one actually has to start with Michel Foucault, because he was the guy who studied those kind of things in the 70s. So he published Discipline Punish book, so I really can recommend that book. And actually, quite recently, there came out some lectures who were recorded at that time. They were just translated into English several years ago. So it's really interesting to see those lectures. And I think it's also the topic about surveillance and disciplinary mechanisms is also a bit related to schools and education. But we were talking yesterday, actually, in the afternoon after the presentations, if you remember, about school disciplinary mechanisms, the importance of the school bell, and so on and so forth. So I think Foucault can answer here some research questions as well. And Foucault's idea is pretty much an historical one. He tended to be an historian. He argues we have gone through the so-called feudal societies of torture, the reformed societies of punishment, to today's disciplinary societies of surveillance. So that's his argument, that we have made an historical development, and in all these different social formations, power and domination was always quite important, but in today's societies we can talk about disciplinary societies according to Foucault. And Foucault's panopticon is an ideal symbol, in order to get an idea what he means with surveillance and disciplinary societies. And I have here a panopticon for you in the next slide. And you know, it's the power in the middle of the room is a supervisor, and all around the cells with the inmates. I'm sure many of you know that anyway. And because the inmates in the cells are not able to see if the supervisor is surveilling or observing them at the moment, all inmates are constantly acting and behaving as they would be surveilled and observed all the time. So he uses this framework, this tower cell dichotomy in order to understand what is going on in modern disciplinary societies. And if we look at the surveillance literature, and that's, I think, it's a huge topic at the moment, in the sense that, well, many books come out at the moment trying to talk about surveillance. And I tried to understand, I tried to analyze and give an overview of the different literature of surveillance. My argument in the 2012 book is that pretty much you can make the separation between those who follow Foucault's idea of power and domination in terms of surveillance, and those who are trying to reject it and saying, well, we are going to live in a society now where everyone can surveil each other, so power and domination don't play a major role. And I'm arguing that those kind of approaches tend to be postmodern, and I think it's typical for them because they somehow forget the idea that surveillance and surveillance dimensions are actually based in material resources. And I think that we still do have certain economic and political actors being able to undertake mass surveillance. And I think that's the important point here, that mass surveillance is possible just by certain actors. And for example, the whole debate about around Edward Snowden and the NSA just showed and indicated that there are big players in modern society who are able to undertake mass surveillance. So I kind of trying to criticize postmodern views of surveillance, and I would see myself also in the tradition. And I think it's quite important to understand surveillance still as a power mechanism and as a mechanism of domination. At the same time, and that's what I mentioned before, Foucault tends to focus on institutions like the school or the prison and hospital. So I think it's a very established critique of institutions in modern society. But what Foucault is not doing in this book is actually, it doesn't have an economic dimension. And I think in order to understand economic surveillance and coming back to the whole social media discussion, my argument in this book is actually that we need to go back to Marx's idea of the economy. And Marx wrote in his introduction to the critique of political economy in 1857 that he has an understanding of the economy in the way that he tries to separate them between the sphere of production, circulation, and consumption. And if we talk about surveillance, I think it's a very useful framework actually to understand and allocate different spheres and dimensions of surveillance. So for example, if we look at the sphere of production, one might consider the surveillance of employees in the Western so-called industrialized societies, we do have a lot of monitoring of employees, which tends to be now self-surveillance, that people are monitoring their outcome by themselves. Academics are a really good example here, actually. But in other countries, in other parts of the world, if you look, for example, at Foxconn in China, they're still going on a very traditional understanding of surveillance, that supervisors and managers are controlling the outcome of workers. If we go back to the sphere of circulation, one might consider, for example, the surveillance of job applicants, or the whole discussion about intellectual property rights. And last but not least, if we have a look at the sphere of consumption, and now I'm coming back to the whole debate of social media, within the sphere of consumption in the economy, I think there's a lot of surveillance going on in terms of consumers, Amazon, and since decade or so, also social media. I think that's just a theoretical attempt how we can consider social media surveillance. After my theoretical introduction, I just would like to focus very briefly about my empirical survey conducted in Austria, and I'm talking a little bit about the results before I'm trying to find ways how we can understand those results based on the theoretical introduction I just gave. And if we have a look at the existing literature about privacy and surveillance, it's quite interesting because we do have kind of different ways how to analyze those things. And there are some people who make very empirical questions about social media, but my argument is that those tend to be very individual in the way they're just looking at things like how users are behaving, which kind of opinions and attitudes users do have. But I think, and among others, that it's still important that you need a more theoretical understanding and analysis of social media in order to understand the social context and the political, economic surveillance on social media. And many people have contributed to this discourse. So, for example, Mark Andreevich or Kristen Fuchs, both of them talk about exploitation and exchange value on social media. Or Tiziana Terranova from Italy, she talks about free labor, immaterial free labor in social media as an example. And last but not least, Graham Murdoch from the UK talks about cultural work and digital labor on social media. So I think there are many, many authors trying to contribute to this discourse. And as Nick mentioned in the morning as well, I think Dallas Nice does have a certain importance here as well, because his concept of the audience work has recently gained importance in the discussion about value creation and labor on the internet. So I think research has been conducted on different levels, trying to carry out and to touching the digital labor concept and paid and unpaid internet labor. And what I'm trying to do in the book is actually to make the connection between those two different things in the way that have conducted an empirical research, which you can see here on the left side of the slide. But I think those kind of empirical research, the existing ones, tend to be very administrative, and I'm trying to make the connection between the empirical work and the theoretical work I just talked about. So I conducted a survey in Austria some years ago, an electronic survey, and I was asking students, Austrian students, about their understanding of social media. You know, as I mentioned before, the contradictory and dialectic characteristics of social media and technology and in capitalism in general. And I asked the students about this antagonism, about these trade-offs, about the risks and potentials. And I got a lot of feedback and responses actually when I carried out this survey. So in the end, I could manage to have almost 4,000 results for my research. And because of the time constraints, I'm not going to go into detail here, but just as a brief overview of some of the results. And I asked the students, what do you consider as the main advantages of social media, social networking sites? And I'm just trying to analyze some categories based on content analysis. And it's not important to go in detail in each of these categories, but I'm just trying to say that the social, communicative, and cognitive aspects of social media were one of the main advantages mentioned. So, for example, more than 40% of the respondents stressed the maintenance of existing contacts, friendship, and family relation as major opportunity. The students also mentioned communication in political and interest groups as important benefit. So I think these results are not a real surprise, but because these are what social media are meant to be. But if you look at the disadvantages and also ask the students, what do you think might be the disadvantages? And it's quite clear that students, and I think not only students, but I focus on students because they can be considered as one of these early adopters in terms of technology. And students are aware of the risks of social media, surveillance, and privacy issues. So, for example, almost 60% of the respondents stressed the economic, political, or cultural surveillance as a result of data abuse, data forwarding, or lack of data protection is for them the main threat on new media. They also mentioned disadvantages about advertising and spam and the commercial selling of personal data as a major concern and risk. People are aware of things that are going on, and I just would like to briefly focus before I finish up to try to answer the question, what does that mean? What does this contradiction actually mean, in having in mind the theoretical background I introduced at the very beginning? And I think there are different ways and different answers one could give to this question, but one possibility how to consider and to answer this question is this here. And you see on the left of my slide a so-called client-server computer network, where you do have the server in the middle and the users, the computers all around. And that's the existing model at the moment on the internet. So you do have Facebook and Google and others in the middle, and we as users all around. That's the established system. Allmer, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, argues that this kind of architecture supports the central storage and control of data. And it also, that's I think quite important from a political economy perspective, it also needs co-creators, people who own those servers and maintain and example, Facebook does have a huge server farm in Sweden maintained just a couple of years ago. I think that's important here, so you need owners of those kind of technological resources. And at the same time, I think it just shows that technologies are also in their design already a control and surveillance mechanism. So it's somehow the risks within technology and the survey results about disadvantages of social media, about privacy and surveillance, what students answered, can be considered within this framework. So I think it just shows that technology and the productive forces, as Marx would call it, are somehow power technologies. So it is about design of technology, as I mentioned at the very beginning when I had this slide between design and assessment of social media. So I think that technologies do have, and social media in particular, internet in particular, do have some problems in their design already. I think it's not possible, I think it's naive to say, well, let's take those kind of technologies and use it in another society. I think that's not possible, or at least not fully, because I think they're in the construction, in the design of those technologies are already a lot of constraints and limitations which are not possible in order to use it in another social context. That's one argument. The second argument is on the right side of this slide. You see here a so-called client-server computer network. And it's meant to be equally privileged, and it supports the direct exchange of files. So each of the computer is at the same time a server and a user. And we do have projects, we do have platforms meant to be work on such an architecture. Pirate Bay, for example, is one of the better-known cases, but there are others as well. And I think it's important for political terms to support those projects, because they support the open access and the common ownership of digital contents. And I think that's also, going back to the title of the conference, I think these are the potentials, the possibilities we do have with new technologies and social media. And they're also hard to control, those kind of platforms, and it also questions the idea of ownership. And it also results permanently in struggles and conflicts between those who want to make the internet and social media private and those who do have a much broader idea of the commons. And I think the trial and the conflict about Pirate Bay just indicated recently what kind of conflicts are going on the internet at the moment. And just to finish up my last argument, because in general I think one can say that internet and social media, as I mentioned many times, brings up new possibilities, especially for movements who do have a lack of resources. In order to come back to my example from the very beginning about the Occupy movement, in order to raise their voice, in order to publish alternative and critical views, cost-effective and on a global level. So I think that's kind of the new development since 1 or 2 decades. And I think those kind of projects like the Occupy movement or Democracy Now! Can be considered as common political projects. And social media platforms, alternative social media platforms like the Global Square at that time, Diaspora, and many more, can be considered what Oskar Nick and Alexander Kluge mentioned as the counter-public sphere, or what Hart and Negri call the multitude. I think these are platforms and movements which we can consider as part of the multitude, or as Ernst Bloch mentioned it, it's the technological potential, the not fully established one, the not yet in society. But at the same time, I think the multitude does have problems at the moment in capitalism, in 21st century capitalism, in the term that those kind of platforms and movements are considered globally still marginalized. I think they do have problems with visibility and publicity and so on and so forth. And at the same time, I think the empire is still quite, or the dominant discourse is still quite powerful in order to set the framework and to define certain values. And Nick was talking about celebrity in the morning, about ideology, when some famous person would come into this room. And I think this just, for me, indicates that those kind of things are still going on. And I think it's an ongoing struggle how to define those things. And that the fact that just 2.5% of the students in the survey indicated that they use social media, just 2.5% for political communication, I think just indicates that those platforms are not a priori political and critical places. So they also used for many, many other reasons. And just the help of Jody Dean on this slide here, I think that we also can consider social media as ideological platforms, bringing up the illusion that everyone now is able to attend, that everyone can now define cultural values. But I think it forgets that most people are still marginalized, are still invisible, and are pretty much powerless in terms to influence political decisions and define cultural values. I'm not saying that social media doesn't have an impact, but I think there's a tendency in the current discourse to overestimate the social media platforms in terms for alternative projects. I think there's still structural asymmetries going on in the participation online. It also shows that there are some limitations in the terms of freedom of speech. It also shows, and going back to my slide from the very beginning, that I think it just shows that technology also has to do with the assessment. So we also need to think about in which society we use at least some elements of technology. So I think those kind of platforms and those kind of technologies could be used differently in another society. I do have some other slides about how we could answer the question about the research results I just introduced in terms of the common and the social factory, which is pretty much based on Italian autonomous Marxism, but I just want to skip these kind of slides in order to finish up. But I think it might be another very good discussion because the social factory and the commons are, I think, really important phenomena, at least in the so-called Western world. But just to finish up, I think social media in my book and in this talk here is a very concrete example, but I think we need to reconsider the bigger picture, the bigger social structure in order to answer the question how far social media are able to contribute to a so-called commons-based information society. So that's the more general question behind that. And I think currently, if we look at different spheres in our society, there are many antagonisms and contradictions going on, be it on the political, cultural, or technological level. And social media is just an example of these contradictions. So we do have many, many problems like ecological in human destruction on the one hand, and on the other hand, the defense and expansion of the commons. So I think these are the contradictions we're going through. And Rosa Luxemburg calls these the development of either socialism or barbarism. I'm not sure if I fully agree with her, but I think we are going towards this development. So I have tried to make the case of a very theoretical approach linked with an empirical study of the example of digital and social media in order to talk about the contradictory dynamics and the technological risks on the one hand, but also the possibilities, the problems, and the potentials. And I think, going back to my question at the very beginning, I think in order to work towards a so-called commons-based information society, I think we need a sociological or social and a technological change, or how Marx called it, we need a change in the productive forces and also in the relations of production. Like, that's one of my main arguments. We need a change on different spheres in our society, in that case on the social and on the technological level. Thank you.
I can only say, wow. Thank you very much for this insightful analysis, and we have 15 minutes for Q&A, so please try to stick to the topics and let's be efficacious and concrete. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for an insightful analysis. I have a couple of questions relating to that also goes a little bit back to what Nick was talking about. You touched several times upon, also in the questions to Nick, about sort of the economic viability of the whole social media economy. And I was wondering, in a sense, there was a kind of a concept I was missing there. In particular, when you were drawing much on Marxist theory, that as far as I can see, and I would like your comment on that, one of the reasons why we have this kind of myth of the media, and perhaps in these days, myth of the social media as some kind of very sort of almost self-fulfilling prophecy, is, as I see it, because of a general shift towards an economy that's much more based on financial speculative capitalism. So the move from sort of traditional economic capital to financial capital seems to be crucial for understanding why the value today is much more based on, in a sense, an idea, an anticipation of future income related to these various economic practices or investments, rather. So it's about, and therefore, in a sense, there's a kind of fundamental economic interest in anticipating value. And that spills in not only into social media, but in a sense to all kinds of investments nowadays. But in particular within the media, it comes to be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy about this being, in a sense, it has to be there and it has to expand. And many of the bigger companies today are, in a sense, not earning very much money, but they are valued highly because they have this kind of financial capitalism behind them. Well, that would be my first question. The other one is perhaps a more normative one, because you touch very much on key issues about privacy and surveillance. But from a critical perspective, you could say, well, privacy and surveillance are, in a sense, not ends in themselves, or they're not something to be avoided fundamentally. It's much more, I would say, the key concept should perhaps from a normative framework rather be, on the one side, individual autonomy, and the other one, on the other side, public accountability. So privacy and surveillance are in a sense to be negotiated against those normative aspects about individual autonomy and public accountability, because in many respects we would like more surveillance. In the case of the Panama Papers, we would say, well, they have really, they have escaped surveillance and we want them to be surveilled because that is publicly accountability to be produced by that surveillance. In that sense, it's a good, common good to have surveillance. So I think perhaps privacy and surveillance should not be considered concepts as ends in themselves, but means to provide something else.
Well, there's actually nothing I would disagree about that actually. I mean, in terms of your first comment, it's interesting because the whole debate about financial capitalism has also to do with social media, of course, because, yeah, as you just mentioned, there are big corporations making money not only on social media, they tend to invest in other issues as well. And I mean, for example, if you remember the slide I have had at the very beginning about the development of Facebook's revenue, I missed out some years between 2012 and 2014. And that was the time when Facebook went on the stock market. And they have had actually quite surprising actually that such a big company did have huge problems in order to keep their profit, because they have had big problems when they went on the stock market. Now they're doing fine, but it just indicates that even big companies might have problems. And I think it also indicates the reasons why only big companies in the end have survived. For example, if you look back the last decades of the economy in terms of the internet economy, I mean, there were many small companies trying to do the same. We, for example, in Austrian Germany, have had a social media platform which was called StudiVZ, which is very similar to the idea of Facebook, but it somehow disappeared then because it was just, somehow overtaken by Facebook, and now these are the dominant discourses in companies. But in terms of financial market, I think there's another issue going on. I'm not sure if we should talk about it, but it's actually about discussion about the immateriality, because there's a certain discourse arguing that companies are shifting their production towards immaterial commodities and products, and that's also the reason why the financial market is such a big issue. But I certainly would doubt the whole discussion about immateriality, because I think it's still based on material resources. But I think there might be another discussion. Going back to your second comment, yeah, here as well, I think there's not much I would disagree about. I mean, I think actually that, as I said at the very beginning, privacy and surveillance are contradicting each other, and I think what my attempt is actually to bring in a class structure within these privacy framework, because I think the current debate isn't really about class, isn't really about inequalities, and pretends to be to argue that it's for everyone in our society to have either privacy or not, and I think that's not the case. But I agree actually in the sense that surveillance, I'm not sure if we should frame it, should name it surveillance, but I think those kind of mechanisms in order to make financial transactions like the Panama Papers more transparent might be a further way in order to contribute to the public understanding that we know what is going on in our society. But I'm just taking that as a comment that you just mentioned.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Foucault a bit, just
it was quite interesting for me, so the question would be something like this. Could it be that defining or usage of privacy as commodity in capitalist discourse is panopticon of 21st century in a way? And also, would you say that privacy today is new currency?
You mean in terms of money?
Yeah. Is it could we say that privacy is new money? Could it be used in that way? So, and also,
what's the idea behind that you think that privacy might be the money?
because in a way we can control privacy online if we want, of course, and in that way we can also control the way that advertisers are using our privacy to go further, to advertise something that is related to our activity online. And also when you were talking about peer-to-peer, maybe I missed it, but what do you think about a digital footprint in that network? I mean, as I know, it's still there, but it's not so public the way the other network that you were explaining. So in a way, if you're using peer-to-peer to download movies or music or whatever, as you can see in those programs, your IP is still public. So maybe just comment a bit more about it.
Well, of course, I think that privacy, the whole debate about privacy is to a certain extent about money and is a currency. So yes, I would agree that the sphere of privacy has been made commodified in capitalism. But as I tried to show in the presentation, I think we shouldn't make the mistake to say because privacy is going through this process, we should abolish privacy at all. I think we need a certain concept of privacy because I think the whole understanding of an individual is also about privacy. I think it's kind of independent of the society we live in. Every individual needs does have some aspirations, and one aspiration I think is also privacy. Another aspiration is about that you fulfill your interests and so on and so forth. So I think strongly in a concept of privacy, and at the same time I think it has been commodified in our society. That's the first comment to your question. And in terms of digital footprint and peer-to-peer networks, the thing is, and I think it just shows a bit the limitations of those kind of technologies in capitalism, because because of the IP address and because the kinds of networking, the material networks, the internet networks you're using are also private. So normally they can follow your way, your footprints very easily. And if you go, for example, on Pirate Bay and you upload a book which you just scanned and is from a well-known publishing house and does have some privacy and copyrights, you are acting illegally. And of course, you can post those things anonymously, but at the same time, as you just mentioned, people can follow your routes, your ways with digital footprints. So I think it just indicates that there are certain limitations within those projects, but I think there are ways how to get out of it. For example, another discussion in terms of alternatives is also that we need to find ways how to support alternative networks. For example, that we not rely on big providers like EE in the UK and other T-Mobile providers who are offering those infrastructures. So I think when we talk about social media, we also need to implement a discussion what kind of material resources do we have and can we find alternatives in order to overcome limitations.
Do you know, or what do you think, what company first began to surveil us, misusing our privacy, selling our data, or in what year it happened? I mean, what was the break point? Some a moment after what everything went wrong.
I think to answer that question, one has to bear in mind that surveillance isn't an issue, a new issue at all actually. I think surveillance and to make money out of private data is a very old idea, and capitalism has always known how to do that. I mean, if you, for example, go back to very traditional media and you are going to, you are asked at the supermarket where do you come from, or what kind of, let's say, age and so on and so forth. These were very traditional forms in order to collect data of consumers and link it to their product. So I think surveillance in that sense isn't new, but I think what got new is that we do enter a sphere where it is being through algorithms and through technology, and I think that came with the implementation of the internet, and especially with social media. You know, I mean, those platforms popped up around 2005. So I think about since the decade or so, I think we entered this sphere of massive surveillance online. But I'm not saying that it's a new phenomenon. I think that's quite important here.
If I could add to this, Banja has an excellent book. It's called Control Revolution, which explains exactly this, and I think that's a very good book to understand how surveillance evolved and why.
Yes, just a brief question following up from that. If, as you say, surveillance becomes a new type of issue because of this, as I call it, managed continuity of this plane of market activity that is the goal of business now to create, then that, which we're all part of course, and social actors, then it raises the question, and I really like the fact you went back to critical theory in Adorno. If Adorno were alive now, how could he imagine performing his negative dialectics, his attempt to stand apart? How can we do that? How would you, in drawing on Adorno now in this new context, do you have any insights into how we might do that? Because he would have been presumably deeply troubled by this, but he probably would have been on Facebook and Twitter, at least on Twitter, sending tweets to other Frankfurt School people for sure. How can we imagine that?
I hope I can take that more as a comment and not as a question.
Sure.
I don't think I can answer that question properly, but let's give it a try. Well, I agree. I think Adorno actually would dig himself in the grave if he could see what's going on at the moment. But at the same time, I mean, I think Adorno brought up some really good ideas, especially in the positive dispute and negative dialectics and so on and so forth. But at a certain point, I also disagree with Adorno because I think it's too negative and too nihilistic, and that has to do in Adorno's biography with the fact that he's relying on Friedrich Nietzsche, which tends to be pretty nihilistic. But I think there were other theorists and sociologists within the Frankfurt School, like Herbert Marcuse, and I think Herbert Marcuse did have a better understanding what is going on in advanced capitalism, and I think he did have a much more positive view, and at least I think it was more dialectical because he considered the emergence of new technologies as also as a possibility. And I think probably it has to do that I'm still pretty young, probably some would call it naive, but I think that new technologies do have some possibilities. Adorno would fully disagree, and I'm sure that he will. So, I strongly believe in those political movements. I strongly believe in the possibilities what new technologies brought, and in that sense, I think I'm more close to Marcuse than to Adorno.
Anyone else? Yeah,
If there's not anyone else, I would like to ask a question. You were talking about surveilling each other, like not including the system, but common people just spying on each other. So we know about stalkers on Facebook or something like that, and everyone has the possibility to do so. But talking about those things, it reminds me kind of Brave New World, 1984. I think not fully, but perhaps 1984 is 2016. And also you mentioned Nietzsche, like a moment ago. And I would also like to ask you, what do you think about his theory of Übermensch? Is it possible for us to have, I know, I would like to be an Übermensch, to have nanotechnologies in my bloodstream, to scan it all the time and some things like that, but no one can guarantee that that nanotechnology actually has some surveillance elements. So how can we make progress without losing our freedoms, even though we lost it already in a certain way?
Well, I think because you just mentioned the issue about nihilism and negativity, it reminds me about another discussion that was going on some decades ago, going back to Nick's comment. Because if we go back to the debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault, if you can watch the video between them on YouTube, and it has been published as well, and I think brings up very clearly the differences between a political economy standpoint, a Marxist standpoint about developments and advanced capitalism and technologies, and a more post-structuralist or post-modern understanding. And I think Foucault is very pessimistic and nihilistic in terms what we are facing and what we are going to. And I think Noam Chomsky is much more dialectical, because he thinks, well, it has to do with our society and it has to do with power. And if we talk about technology, we have to ask again what kind of society we live in. And Chomsky, he was pretty young at that time, then tries to make the point that he can't imagine a society where we kind of overcome those power relations. And Foucault is very pessimistic about that. So it's really good discussion. And I think it goes a bit back to your comment as well. So in terms of negativity, nihilistic and Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas, I'm really skeptical about their views. And in terms of nanotechnology, I'm really not sure if I'm the right person to comment on that. I mean, it's really not my area, but I would second guess actually, if we look at nanotechnologies, that we will find a similar development, that there are some elements which one might consider as progressive, but I assume that nanotechnologies bring up so many risks in our society. And, I mean, for example, the discussion about nuclear power was very similar, that there are so many risks in it. And again, I would frame it back to the question, in which society we produce and design those kind of technologies, and in which society we are trying to apply them. So it's, for me as well, a very important question about the society.
Okay, we'll have a very, very short break now, like 5 minutes, and then we'll continue with our third keynote speaker for today. Thank you very much.